A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. Created by Bloomberg Philanthropies, Bloomberg Connects lets you access museums, galleries and cultural spaces around the world on demand. Download the app to access digital guides and explore a variety of content. Hello, I'm Ben Luke and welcome to A Brush With, the podcast from the art newspaper in which I talk to artists about their influences, from writers to musicians, filmmakers and of course other artists, and the cultural experiences that have shaped their lives and work. And in this episode it's a brush with Igshaan Adams, who explores human space, both interior and exterior, and how that space speaks to racial, sexual and historical identities. Working in particular with wall and floor-based textiles and sculpture, often brought together in atmospheric installations, Igshaan does not depict people but evokes their presence. He particularly refers to the community in which he grew up in apartheid South Africa and suggests the marks people have made in that environment, from traces on domestic floors to so-called desire lines, pathways forged in landscapes and cityscapes that reveal how we subvert the structures put in place to control and surveil us, and thus act as everyday gestures of resistance. Igshaan's art is based on research but also deeply informed by his own story. Though referencing great difficulty and hardship, it is a language of unashamed beauty and elegance. Igshaan was born in South Africa amid the racial segregation of apartheid, and specifically in Bonteheuwel in the Cape Flats suburb of Cape Town in 1982, to a Christian Namakoisan mother and a Muslim father. He studied at the Ruth Prowse School of Art in Cape Town, which, as we'll hear, provided crucial lessons for his life, and not just in terms of art education. And soon after graduating, he was immediately exploring his personal and social background through art. For instance, one of his earliest works was In Between, in which he took several prayer mats used by Muslim people and stitched them together in a floor-based installation. It featured the silhouette of a snake, a symbol in some belief systems of treachery and elsewhere of knowledge, and also directly referenced a dream Igshaan had of a snake emerging from a pool of water. So from the start, he drew directly on personal experience and wider cultural references. Crucially, the mats were used, found objects that bore the traces of the people that had ritually preyed on them. He continued piecing together found items in a number of installations using linoleum taken directly from the homes of people in Bonteheuwel. Untouched other than being installed together, the flooring was testament to lived experiences with worn sections, stains and dents. It reflected everyday existence, of course, but as Igshaan has hinted, it potentially reflected the scars of violence as well as familial warmth, something he experienced personally in a difficult childhood. He describes the found floors as documents, as they've accumulated information over time and silent witnesses to the vicissitudes of living and surviving in a historically underprivileged and segregated community, and how bodies navigate the space of the home. The patterns and unintentional marks on the linoleum were later transcribed onto tapestries in which beads and rope are woven in amongst the threads. Here, mediated through the conversion from the found object to the painstakingly made tapestry, they acquire another level of significance. Not only do they mark the presence of those whose feet trod on the linoleum, but they honour it in the care with which the marks, both deliberate and accidental, are rendered. And this, as we'll hear, is a crucial factor in Igshaan's work. For all the complexity and struggle it evokes, it's often exquisitely made and installed. Among Igshaan's most beautiful works are the floor-based textiles that he's made in recent years. In them, he offers a counterpoint to the linoleum pieces and related tapestries by exploring the exterior world around Bonteheuwel and other townships in the Cape Flats area. These are the pieces that explore the aforementioned desire lines, also known by social scientists as free will ways, routes made in defiance of the segregational and controlling state infrastructure that in South Africa is the legacy of apartheid. In that regime, highways and other boundary structures marked official permitted routes by which non-white communities could circulate, but the desire lines are the unofficial pedestrian paths adopted by those communities in defiance of urban planners. In Igshaan's work, the spaces between sections of exquisitely made carpet, again rich with different textures and unexpected materials, evoke them. He uses satellite imagery as the basis for these textile terrains, and standing over them, you're given an unusual perspective, as if you're at once within a landscape and experiencing it distantly with a bird's eye view. Again, while describing the history and legacy of the apartheid regime, Igshaan also imbues them with personal testimony. For Linloop, a vast wall-based piece made in early 2024 for the ICA Boston, he used aerial photography of the footpaths between a sports field and a recreational space near his hometown to explore painful memories of the hyper-masculine culture of sports he grew up with as a young queer person. Using chains and mohair as well as the familiar beads and rope, the work is rendered knowingly in hues of pink. Accompanying Linloop and other recent installations are sculptures that are known as dust clouds, apparently weightless gatherings of disparate materials that look as if they've casually blown into the exhibition space. Often embellished with delicate decorative detail, the dust clouds emerge through a chance discovery in the studio, as we'll hear, but Igshaan links them to the dust kicked up in the real dance performed by the indigenous Nama community in South Africa, part of Igshaan's maternal heritage. Indeed, dance has increasingly preoccupied him in recent years, and in a body of work made for his exhibition at the Hepworth in Wakefield, he created a means of recording on canvas the movements of dancers from the Garage Dance Ensemble, a group with which he has familial associations. He then took those movements as the basis for woven works. So again, Igshaan is exploring the traces of human activity, and it was this with which I began our conversation. What, I asked, prompted this interest in evoking presence in absence?
It's just curiosity, to be honest with you. I think it comes from my own curiosity about what kind of traces the experiences I had, and especially the experiences I had as a kid in my family home. I think that's where it all started for me anyway. I was genuinely curious about how that environment had kind of influenced who I became. Every aspect, every quality of the environment, including the size of the home, the qualities within the home, the way it was decorated, the people within that home, but of course the political environment in which the home was in, So all of these aspects of that environment was something that I was just really curious about.
Right.
How could I have been different if I was raised in a different environment? And it was a genuine question. And so for me, I guess these traces became little things that I could grab hold on to as information that could help me piece something together. And I guess ultimately it wasn't necessarily about having very clear answers. And I guess I found a lot of these changes within me over time, just purely through the process of looking at the memories, the people, the experiences I've had in there, and how it all came together ultimately in my practice, I guess.
It's interesting you talk about looking there, because one of the questions I was going to ask you was specifically about views, about the kind of aerial view of the landscape, if you like, that we see often in the work, but then that extreme close-up where you're focusing on linoleum and you're literally lovingly depicting the stains on a linoleum floor through textile and so on. So it seems to me that there's a really curious relationship with focus in your work in terms of zooming in and then zooming right out and so on. Tell me more about that.
For me, I find it interesting how many people actually struggle to hold two views of something, whether it is just yourself within a scenario or a situation you find yourself in, to hold two views, meaning to both be in it and be able to observe these details and kind of be immersed in it, but also to hold a distant view of a situation has been such a tool that I've been able to use in my own life, and it's given me so much perspective that is important to me to continue to really highlight this idea that one holding multiple views. And I think this is also just something that I have accepted as part of my job, to be able to open up or at least expose multiple views of one thing, and see if I can put myself in multiple positions. Years ago, I saw this little clip on Facebook, which explains it really beautifully, I think, where it was a professor of some Ivy League university, I think it was, who was talking about this perspective. And he did this little trick, and I've done it in talks before with audiences where, he asked the audience to raise their non-dominant hand and to click 5 times. And then he asks everybody to write a capital letter E on your forehead, And so, of course, people do this. But in the process of doing this, there is this little moment where you are either considering that view to be your own view or the person who you are doing it for. So you have to think about whether you will be writing the E on your forehead in a mirrored image, or is it legible to your own viewpoint? And I think that idea, that moment of having to choose, it's curious to also note that most creative people that I've done this with, they tend to think about my viewpoint or the other's viewpoint, so the E will appear in a mirror image on their forehead when they do it. Whereas often, like my partner is a science guy, for instance, he's a medical guy, and he, of course, considered it only his own view. Okay. But I think it's interesting how, we in this moment had to decide. But then I guess for me also, I can take it a step further and say, if we did to imagine this three-dimensional E in space, then of course, there isn't just two views, my view and your view. There's also multiple views if it's a three-dimensional space. So yeah, I like to think about that idea of forcing myself into another perspective, another view, even if it's about a situation that involves myself.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that manifests in terms of the way that we experience the work in the gallery as well. So
thank you.
Quite often your work will dramatically appear to us across the room, and we will be enticed to wander up close to it. And then, of course, when we wander up close to it, it gets a whole level of texture that you don't see when you first see it, and in a way, a level of complication that you don't see when you first view the work. And that seems to me to be crucial to the way that your work's experienced.
100%, and that's exactly the point. In my experience, of course, here in South Africa, given the history of racial division and segregation, that I often said that if people knew everything that there is to know about me, surely they will treat you differently, It is the human condition to make snap judgments and to kind of read something on face value, and that's part of our survival, and that is something we all need to understand in a kind of distant, non-judgmental way, I think. But I think that complication and that detail and all of that information kind of points to the idea that there's so much more to know, and what happens when we do know, how do our responses change, and how do we deal with each other differently? If I saw someone in the street, and it is natural to make that judgment, I feel, of course, it has all sorts of consequences, which is unfortunate. But I think it's important to stay conscious. And I think that's what it means to me is to pull the viewer. And also it's seductive, I like the idea of seducing a viewer by the beauty and textures and getting lost in the detail, which I think gives me the opportunity to maybe then pick up a more serious conversation in a way that the person is more receptive to receive.
Interestingly, you said about the work being beautiful despite the trauma. And that's a crucial factor as well, isn't it? That's another key element of the work, that you are dealing with extremely difficult material in terms of the community's trauma, in terms of your family's trauma and your own personal trauma. And yet you're not shying away from pleasure in the work at the same time.
I decided from the beginning that beauty was going to be a big part, and aesthetics. And remember, I came up into the art world when there was always this big question mark, I think, around my work to begin with, because I wasn't shying away from the beauty. And in fact, I was deliberately leaning into it, even though I might have gotten people being suspicious of it being decorative. And I think in the art world, of course, decoration is the big bad word, and nobody wants to be called decorative. And that was the concern when it started. But thankfully, things have changed, and people are appreciative once again of aesthetics and beauty as an important part of art, and as it should be.
But there's also a metaphor in there, isn't there? And it seems to me that your work is full of metaphors. Yeah. Even the very term desire lines. I know it's like actually a technical term.
It is.
Used by social scientists, for instance, to describe these ways in which humans navigate around the set social structures. Yeah. But desire lines, of course, in your work means a lot more than just that social phenomenon, right?
No, I definitely grabbed onto that idea of the desire line. The term desire line is such a provocative term. It already, when you hear it, already conjures up some feelings of choosing a path that one desire versus a path that one was given or laid out to you. So absolutely, there are metaphors for me in terms of, I certainly can relate to the idea of having to create a path for myself as an artist especially, but also just in my life, because art wasn't a part of my life at all in terms of museums and galleries. I didn't have any idea of the art world, although I had people in my life like my father and my aunts who were very artistic and creative and always making things, which obviously had such a big influence on what my practice ultimately turned into. Also, just going back to the beauty and why I chose from the beginning for beauty to be part of my language was, first of all, of course, I think when you grow up in an environment where there's a clear lack of beauty, the space itself, the streets, the roads, there wasn't necessarily an emphasis on keeping that space beautiful. So I was always aware of that absence of beauty, even though I would say my family probably made quite an effort in beautifying our home. That we always had a garden and the facade was always kept in a certain way. So, and there was a certain dignity about that. It's also why I chose the linoleum to begin with, because this linoleum was such a strong material, which represented that act of hopefulness, where for the majority of the community, whether there was money or not, or whether it was a year where, the family knew it was going to be a difficult Christmas, the little bit of resources you would spend on buying linoleum and replacing the floor with new, clean, fresh linoleum for the new year. And I think I loved that. As a kid, I was always involved in making the space beautiful for Christmas, decorating it, painting the house, but also replacing linoleum. Mm-hmm. I think there's a hopefulness there. So I decided if I was going to be dealing with my own story and other people's stories from that environment, I was going to make sure that the beauty of that experiences becomes part of it too, because it's not an environment where it's only hopelessness and pain. And, yes, I needed to deal with my own trauma and the pain that came with it, but there were so many beautiful moments too that happened on those linoleum pieces. So I wanted both to be present.
Absolutely. And it's interesting in terms of the desire lines and how they relate to the imagination and so on, and to your own personal desires. The piece that you did for the ICA Boston earlier this year seems to me really illustrative in terms of how desire might manifest in the work, because on the one hand, it relates to this trauma about hypermasculinity, the playing field, sports and so on, and that you wanted in a sense to cross that sort of barrier. And therefore, this work became, on the one hand, a kind of topographical description of that space, but it also became about your imagination and your desire to cross it. And it seems to me you're embodying so much of your personal experience within that work through metaphor and so on.
Absolutely. I was wondering whether or not through my own imagination, I could actually just kind of influence my relationship to those spaces. Because of that trauma that I experienced earlier on, I wondered if I, now as an adult, could influence how I relate to those spaces. So I made this work, first of all, deciding that it was going to be a soft, beautiful, so we use this material like mohair, mixed it up with chain, which is obviously also, it has a certain richness if you mash them up. So I wanted, again, that to have that softness and the beauty and the pink hue to be both obviously pink, but still grounded. It's not necessarily a pink that is plastic in tone. But I was curious if it would be effective, because I think any queer boy could tell you how painful those environments can be. And I also believe that those early experiences, there's so much time has gone by, but it still affects us. It still affects the choices we make and how we operate. And I guess that's also where the dance prints came in, that question of how those earlier experiences still has effect, but on such a subtle level that we're not necessarily aware that maybe through movement, those things can be expressed, was the question I had for that.
That's right. You said that dance can be a form of catharsis, and that can be all different kinds of movement, if you like.
No, sure. And it relates to, I also have like this background in Sufism, I guess. I'm definitely not a Sufi, and I've never made that commitment, but I had spent 4 years with a teacher. I lived with them, and she's this elderly woman who kind of taught me what she knew about this spiritual path she took. She's obviously been such a big influence. But during my time there, movement as part of something called zikr, or remembrance. It's an act of remembering who we truly are and who we've forgotten that we are. And so movement is a way of reconnecting to this dormant kind of understanding of who we are. And so I knew that it is an effective thing. It works. It's not something I think might work. I know for a fact that it has worked in my own life in a different setting. So for me, the dance then was just the best way to kind of deal with this in a non-religious setting, I guess.
I'm really interested in this idea that you've expressed, that you see yourself not just as the creator of the works, but as the carer for the works.
Absolutely.
And I know that at one stage also you had a job as a gardener.
Yes.
It seems to me that you tend to the works.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me that there's a really interesting tenderness that comes from your process, and that looms large in terms of the way that we experience it and interpret it.
I think at some point I had to accept that, as much as I obviously talk about myself and my own experiences, but really not about me, or at least that I wish to put myself aside and understand that there's something much more and much greater, which in a sense is a relief, and that the work itself is almost an entity that has its own desires. And so I become the conduit, really, and that I can then help it get to where it needs to be if I remain connected to it throughout the process, So in that kind of scope of things, I think it's easier then to work with assistants to help me help this work to be everything that it can be, rather than me pushing an agenda. Now, there are times where I push an agenda, where it is about what I want versus a curiosity of what this thing wants.
Right.
Because there are times where I have a very clear idea of what I want the work to be.
I'm interested in this idea that sometimes chance can play a role. So, for instance,
Yeah.
the dust clouds, as you call them, they emerged from you noting that your materials would become entangled in the studio, and you saw the possibility in that.
Absolutely. And in fact, in the beginning, it was also just a way of me expressing creative frustration. Like I felt like there were years in the beginning. I think now things are different. Things are a lot different. It's become easier for me to step into the studio. But I certainly remember a period in my life where stepping into my studio was such a scary thing, and you don't know where to start or what. And I started just picking things up from the floor, and things that already or naturally started entangling, suspending it in space, and just constantly throwing whatever I can find, whatever debris, instead of in the bin, I would just attach it or entangle it into this mass that grew over time. And it was an effective way for me to then let this frustration out and then find a quieter space within myself through this process that I can then make the work that became the work that I put out there. But of course, through this process, that I realized that this thing that I had no attachment to begin with is starting to form into a lot more interesting forms and ideas, even that was showing me things about myself, a little bit like scribbles or a bit like the Rorschach thing, actually. I was also learning a lot here.
It's a subconscious desire.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so it became the fun part of my practice, and it still is. It's probably the part of the practice that I enjoy the most, because it's just me being experimental and playful with forms and materials, and curious where else we can push the forms, what direction next. The moment we're actually going through a phase in the studio of 4 months of just experimentation where all projects had been suspended. So we are now going through this, which is a lot of fun.
Let's move on to the questions that we ask all our guests. You've already said that you grew up in not a very artistic household, despite the fact that you had sort of creative people around you. But who was the first artist whose work you loved?
I would say the first person that I had a real experience with, the first artist locally that I felt like, oh, this is what it's supposed to be. This is what I'm supposed to be feeling. I was absolutely in awe. And it was Nandipha Mntambo. She's a local artist who uses cowhide and molded it over her body to create these kind of bodily forms. And first of all, it was how she transformed this known material into something new and fresh and so believable, even that you could, she wasn't hiding what the material was. It was a simple intervention, but super effective. But I think also, most of all, it was the strong smell in the space. It was so overwhelming, and I felt immersed in this environment of these figures and the cowhide. But I guess it just stayed with me. I would credit Nandipha with giving me my first kind of real experience of this is what it could be. This is actually what it really could be. I think the first person I absolutely loved would be Nicholas Hlobo, a local artist too, because, of course, he's also queer and dealing with his queerness versus culture and his environment growing up. I also just kind of loved listening to him speak about his work. He had such clarity and he had such wisdom,
He speaks beautifully about the work, actually, really beautifully.
Incredible speaker. So, I did 2 years at an art school here in Cape Town. I think all of my answers probably had Nicholas Hlobo in there. And then, so those would be the two artists that I think had big impact on me early on.
And which historical artist do you turn to the most today?
It's been the same artist for many years. I think it's Louise Bourgeois. I think I'm still kind of hung up on her and still go back to her. She was also just very genuinely curious about her relationship with her father and the existential questions she had. But she related it to her physical body and also the kind of her psychological life, which were all things I relate to.
Yeah, and one of the great things about the way that she engaged with that psychological life or a psychic life is the way that she immediately saw the potential for art making from learning about herself, it seems to me.
Absolutely.
Rather than illustrating points, it was about how can I turn my inward thoughts outward into the world, sort of thing.
A genuine curiosity about her own experiences and how this can be manifested in form, materials, and in a true expression. So, yeah, she's up there for me.
It must be really powerful for you then to be showing your work alongside her. I think there have been at least one textile show recently where Louise Bourgeois was in the same show as you.
100%. No, it was a moment. I tried not to think too much about it too. I might just think out. The show just came down at the Barbican where she was on that show, and also a work that I've always loved. And I finally got to see in person. No, it was amazing.
Is there also something about Bourgeois which is her ability to be very fleet-footed between materials that appeals to you?
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. That is a big part of it. But she's also just super inventive with form. She was never bound by one specific material, one medium in any way.
There's been a lot of commentary on your work which relates to the history of Islamic design and particularly Islamic textiles. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, are there specific reference within Islamic design and textiles that you refer to, i.e. will you literally look at an image of an Islamic textile and draw from it? There are obviously found objects in the work, but do you look at design and take ideas from those?
No, I wouldn't say necessarily. When I was at art school, there was a period where I was kind of consuming a lot of these imagery and patterns and textiles and curious about it. But I wouldn't say that I've looked at pattern. What I have done is certainly square kufik, which is a specific style of calligraphy that comes from Iran. It's typically associated with boulders, or you have these entire buildings covered in this particular style. And of course, it has this square feeling to it, which makes it perfect for weaving. And especially for me at the time when I had just started weaving and the technique was still very much a straightforward back and forth on the loom, and it just made sense for the technique I was using at the time and the materials. But beyond that, it was again just the text itself, actually. It was about these chapters in the Quran that we grew up with, that most of them I didn't necessarily understand the meaning at the time. So I really wanted to give myself the opportunity to dig into some of these very paradoxical kind of explanations of things that, it kept me up at night, these things that wouldn't leave me alone in that I needed to know, I wanted to know, and why can't I know? And so, yeah, I made these tapestries with these texts, but I also put myself through this difficult process of coming to terms with what it is telling me.
And did you find that through making in response to those texts, again, we talked about catharsis in the work, Did you find that through making you were able to be reconciled, if you like, to the texts that were troubling you?
In some cases, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I guess I was lucky that I had this Markia at the time, my Sufi teacher. She was the one I would go to and ask questions. I mean, in my earlier career, I was dealing with portraits and representational things. So I think this was one of those issues I had at the first, and also maybe why I jumped into abstraction and why I made sure that abstraction as well as representational works are part of my practice. I was, I guess, also just kind of wanting to be a good Muslim, I think, is maybe and she helped me understand this. And I mean, the answer she gave me, I remember once speaking about creativity and just having questions. So why can't I draw a face if I was given this talent to do so? And so her explanation was about the eyes, that the eyes are a problem, that if you do draw or paint a face, that it would be better to lower the gaze, to not make the eyes visible, to either veil it with something or to make sure that the gaze is lowered in some way, because in her explanation, negative energy is able to penetrate the object through the eyes and remain stuck in that object. And so you don't want to live with that in your space,
Oh, interesting.
I remember asking her about creativity itself because I was curious. And she said creativity is so important that the entire universe is created based on that energy and it permeates everything. And she was explaining that some people think of themselves as non-creative, which is absolutely ridiculous because it's not a quality, but rather an energy that is accessible to all of us. And we engage in any way. We create our lives, we create our experiences, we create our outfits and our sandwiches. And creativity is just present. You cannot not engage with it. It's just some people understand how to use it to their benefit, or at least how to master it. And she used this analogy of if you think about water dripping on a wall, and over time, you'll see bits of life forming. And if you give it enough time, an entire planet can form. I mean, this is kind of how she explains it, that our existence is all because of this process of creativity.
How interesting.
And I've kind of used that analogy in some artworks where we've also just kind of started weaving in some spot and allowed it to expand and deliberately tried to not think too much about what it needs to be, but be a little bit more natural in just let it be.
Which contemporary artist do you most admire? You've already talked about Nicholas Hlobo, but...
Yes, I did. I would say I love Wengechi Mutu. I love very much. Otobang Kanga, of course, is also pretty. Ibrahim Mahama, I love very much. So African artists, who else?
It's interesting you talk about Otobong, I spoke to for this podcast last week.
Oh, amazing.
But again, a fluency of language and a concern with depictions of different registers of world making and so on. There's lovely correspondences with your work, I'd say.
100%. So yeah, these are the people I admire at the moment. But of course, next week, if you ask me that question, it might be different.
Of course. What do you have pinned to your studio wall?
I do tend to buy art of young artists in my environment. I think that's pretty important to me now, and I quite enjoy that. I also have a project space in my studio now. We show young artists, and we just opened up a show 2 weeks ago. So my walls would be covered with other people or young artists, and specifically young artists either from Cape Town or at least South Africa. And then what else? I mean, I certainly have lots and lots of drawings and paintings of my nieces and nephews. Whenever I leave, there's always a painting left for me when I come back.
Oh, that's so nice.
So that's everywhere. I have a little office in the studio and it's covered with these children's art.
Do you have anything near where you're working? In other words, can you allow other influences into the space where you're physically making the work?
I guess at this point, I'm so conscious of what I consume and what I allow in, and more importantly, at which time, So what I mean is that if I am trying to conceive of new projects or kind of figuring out the direction, that I very much limit what I look like and what I read or what I consume, that I make sure that my focus remains internal and curious. But then there are other times, of course, where I open myself up to consume and to be influenced and to be in that kind of thing. But I feel like I've become super, super conscious and controlling in a way of what it is that I am inserting into my own consciousness. And certainly with social media, I mean, it has a bigger effect on us than I think we realize.
A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects, the arts and culture app. The free app offers access to more than 450 cultural organisations through a single download, with new guides being added regularly. They include Neon in Athens in Greece, the British Library in London, and Sculpture Milwaukee in Wisconsin in the US. Among the other guides on the app are several museums and galleries that have shown Igshaan Adams' work, including 2 galleries where his work can be seen in 2024, ICA Boston and the Hepworth Wakefield. Download Bloomberg Connects and you'll see that the guide to the Hepworth includes a range of features about the gallery's David Chipperfield designed building, its garden and its collection and exhibitions. Find out more about Barbara Hepworth and the remarkable gift from her family to the gallery, which includes a unique collection of surviving prototypes in plaster and aluminium from Hepworth's studio, with audio content including Hepworth herself talking about the significance of her sculptural tools. To explore digital guides to all the partnering institutions, download the app today. It's available from the App Store and Google Play, and you can keep up to date by following Bloomberg Connects on Facebook, X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram. Which museum or gallery do you visit most frequently?
To be honest, probably the gallery that represents me. I tend to go to their shows.
This is Blank?
Yeah, Blank projects, exactly. Yeah. And then I go to Zeitz and Norval Foundation locally. It's a nice space to go on a day trip because they have a beautiful restaurant, such a nice environment, and it's a bit of a travel. Internationally, it just depends on where I find myself in the world, I guess, that would determine what I see.
Was it important to you that Blank was almost like an artist-run space or a kind of project space before it was a commercial gallery? Did that mean a lot in terms of your early development?
I think at the time I wouldn't have known that it would make a difference. When I first signed on, I was still a young artist, so I wouldn't make that claim, but it has become a big part of why I've stayed with them, I would say. I think my gallerist both used to be an artist and he had this project space, and I think it just made such a big difference in terms of our relationship and also the decisions he's made. I've been very lucky in this relationship too, because we almost started out together in a way. He was one of the first artists he signed on when he became commercial. So I feel like we figured it out together.
Yeah.
No, I think this is probably one of the more valuable relationships I have professionally and personally.
Which cultural experience changed the way you see the world?
The ones that come to mind is probably these residencies that I've done. Early on, I had a residency in Basel, Switzerland, early on in my career, I would say. And then there was one I did at the Paul Klee Center in Bern years ago. I understood so much through this 2 weeks of spending time with people from around the world. But more importantly, I think what that allowed me and why it changed how I operated is that I fully accepted in those experiences that I do have a contribution to make. I think that's maybe the one thing that stood out to me. Before then, I was a little bit like, maybe not as confident as I am now, But I realized that the fact that I'm not as educated, I didn't go to the local university, shouldn't be the reason why I don't push myself. The fact that I still have a contribution that I could make, and I accepted that in those moments. So that changed everything. And then I could just be as ambitious as I wanted to be and push the work and not hold back.
Yeah. I want to ask also about, it's not so much a cultural experience because it's your work, but the making of this work with your father called Bismillah.
Oh, yes, that was life-changing.
So therefore it's a cultural experience because you're making it, but still that's a pivotal work in your career, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, 100%. The best explanation I can give, I guess, is that this little kid inside, I guess, died. Something died. Something was let go of, that I was then able to, for the first time, accept my father as a human being and open space for a new relationship and I guess forgiveness ultimately. But it was a lot more than that, because at that point, we'd already worked on forgiving and moving forward and building a relationship. But this performance, it was like pressing a reset button. basically.
Yeah. And he was embalming you through this performance, right?
He
So
was.
you're there naked apart from a towel, is that right?
Yes.
Over your torso. And then he is slowly, basically as if he was preparing for your body to be buried.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, if this were to happen to me, if I were to die and my body is prepared, there would be more people around and things like that. So I had to set it up in a way that it worked, the performance. So I used a table and layered it with multiple pieces of cloth and then a plastic sheet that had a seam at the center. And then I was kind of laying on top of that seam. So my father was able to roll me over and remove the plastic to expose the cloth that he ultimately wrapped me up in. After the performance in the wrapping, well, first I would say that what was effective in the performance is that he didn't have to fake anything, It wasn't acting. It was for him. He had a job to do and he was doing the job, which really worked because it meant that every time he touched me, every kind of washing he did, it was about how that history we have was almost present with each touch, if that makes sense. That he didn't have to pretend because we had already lived this life and so much darkness that it was present anyway. And I think that was probably what made it effective. And when I was wrapped up and in this cocoon of fabrics, and there were a few moments where I got pretty scared. I couldn't breathe. I was screaming, please lift up the cloth. I can't breathe. And I panicked at some moment. But I'm glad I didn't break the performance or got out of it, because once I kind of calmed myself down and came out of this cocoon of fabrics, I knew immediately something was different with me. I knew something was lighter, something was over with.
Right.
It was such a profound experience. And that feeling stayed with me, for 48 hours. It was a very weird sensation of not so willing to judge something as good or bad, that it didn't matter. There was this overwhelming feeling that it never mattered. After 48 hours, I was back to being my judgmental self. But I'll never forget this moment of knowing that space exists.
That's amazing. This is not a cultural experience, but I wanted to ask you about the fact that I read that you nearly died twice, and you said that this also helped you transform as a person and as an artist.
Yeah, and actually quite close to each other, these two events. The first one, I was attacked, or I was stabbed in my lung, and it was actually quite violent and unfortunate. And strangely, the person who did it, we are kind of friends on good terms.
Wow.
I know. It's crazy, but it's fine. And then the second time, I almost drowned in the ocean. And in both cases, alcohol was involved. I was drunk at the time. And I got caught up in this rip current in the ocean. I'm not the best swimmer, and now it's illegal to swim in that same spot. And the year later, exactly a year after this happened to me, a father and his two kids drowned in that same spot. And that it was closed for swimming. So, a real experience. But I guess the benefit of those experiences were that after that, I just told myself that now life is just a bonus. I should have died. So I might as well now pursue being an artist. I was still a gardener at the time and didn't really believe that the art thing is possible for me. It was so not part of my upbringing. It was something that I was too unfamiliar with. But I guess after these experiences, I really had nothing to lose. And it was a really powerful place to operate from.
How extraordinary. Which writers or poets do you return to?
I would have to say Rumi. I have this book about love poems on Rumi, and I have it close by.
Do you have it in the studio as well?
At home. I have it out at home. So I have 3 books that has kind of a more spiritual tone to it that charges my batteries a little bit.
And in terms of what it gives you, if you have it at home, I'm just trying to imagine the effect on your art. Is it about a quiet space, if you like? The poetry is so beautiful, obviously, but what do you get from it that then can help you in terms of your making, if you like?
I guess it comes back to the perspective thing. It always pushes you to take another perspective on something you think you know. And I think that is pretty valuable. I can actually show you these 2 books quickly. I picked the one up and This book I picked up and it's broken. It's falling apart.
Igshaan is currently showing me a very, very well thumbed book. It's scratched.
It's broken.
Yeah, it's folded. But you can see it's well loved.
I picked it up actually. It's called Companion of God. This woman is called Dadi Janki. It's a spiritual teacher. But she reminds me so much of Nandipha, the woman who taught me, that I can literally hear her voice when I read it. I feel like Nandipha has become the voice of my consciousness. And then there's this book, The Secret of Secrets. And this is also maybe one of the more well-known Sufi writers. And it's the one book that keeps me baffled. Nothing is made easy. Everything is a question mark. And, it's just one of those things that won't leave you alone. There's always another layer, it seems. There's always another deeper layer. There's always something more. Everything always seems to be dividing and multiplying to a point where you can never get to a straightforward answer.
And that's an important quality for your art to have, isn't it? I think your work is full of question marks, and I mean that in the best possible sense.
I hope so. I hope so. No, I certainly don't have answers if anybody's looking for that.
What music or other audio do you listen to while you're working?
We play the radio. We like listening to the radio in the studio. I guess my music taste is quite varied. You know what? I like listening to other people's music. When I'm in a car, in an Uber, I'm always asking people to play me music that they like so I can be introduced to something new, for instance,
It tells you a lot about someone.
Yeah, I think so. But I'm always asking people to share music on what they like.
I wanted to ask you about the Real Dance, which is this dance which inspired the Dust Cloud series, effectively, because it's about the kind of, again, we're talking about traces and residues. It's what emerges from this dance, that these dust clouds, effectively. But I wanted to ask about the music because they have a kind of power that exists beyond the visual, it seems to me. I wanted to ask you about the music that is happening during the Real Dance, and if that is a factor in you conjuring that image, if you like.
The music plays a big role in the way the dance is performed, for sure. It's got this kind of guitar thing going on, that a very distinctive and particular rhythm that I would associate with that region and the dance, for sure. But, I think my interest definitely is probably more towards like you said, the dust and the imprints so the first body of work I did of the dance was after the dance had been performed, is to record the ground and the imprints the body had left through kicking and that kind of thing. I would also want to just clarify that the dust clouds, I think the Real Dance inspired me to think of them as dust clouds, but these forms had existed before, these wires, entanglements, these things, before I started relating to them as clouds.
Yes.
There were already masses and things that I projected different types of meaning onto, But the Real Dance, of course, I knew about the Real Dance and I remembered it from when I was a kid. My grandparents used to take us down to Namakula, and I remember them dancing around the barbecue, the fire, when we had these family things. And so I always was aware of that dance, but I was almost reintroduced to it at some point. And then I remembered, and then that became how I see these clouds. But what I love about it, of course, first of all, the metaphor you're talking about is that disruption of the earth. If before the dance, the earth is just kind of complacent in a way. This dust had settled in a certain way and it will stay there unless something comes and disrupts it. And I find meaning in that too, that top layers being the opportunity for something to be disrupted, to settle in a new way,
What other media influence your work? I was wondering if we might talk about dance at this point.
I wouldn't say that I am so keenly interested in dancing itself, but rather what dance offers me in terms of the movement and the rhythm and whatever it can then access internally. I think my curiosity remains about what happens within the dancer and the history that, the residue of those experiences that is still there. And so when I work with the dancers, the conversations I had with them was rather more to do with their own experiences and the things they are curious about, what's going on within them, and whether or not they would allow themselves to, in an improv way, just jump into movement. Let's not think too much about it. Let's be curious about how can I disturb something in me that can then be expressed through the dance. And then, of course, there were certain limitations we put together, certain ideas we played around throughout the workshop. So we would ask people to, try and go internally and, direct your consciousness to be aware and sensitive to what you're experiencing internally. But then at the same time, split your consciousness where you yourself are trying to do that, but you have to navigate a small space while someone else is doing the same thing. So there'll be 3 people all trying to go internally, but then still having to share space. Or, a small space and just put all the dancers on there. So it's really a mashup of bodies who are desperately trying to say something and be internally, but then in almost this kind of impossible setup.
And you work with the Garage Dance Ensemble, which obviously has a very deep personal connection to your family. Yes. Your uncle, John Linden, co-founded it. Yeah. He and his partner, Alfred Hinkle, were hugely important figures in terms of making choreographing works during the apartheid era and so
Absolutely.
On. So there's so much that's bound up with your autobiography and so many of your works, right?
Well, yeah, John is my mom's cousin, so not my mom's brother, just to be clear. But I think here in South Africa, we uncle, your cousin is a sister.
Right. Yeah.
It just means close relation. And he was the one queer person in my life growing up. He was the one, maybe the biggest influence on me in terms of my queer identity, but it wasn't always positive. John was very successful as a choreographer with his partner. We all knew that they were doing amazing things in the world of dance, but that didn't necessarily guarantee him respect as a very flamboyant gay man in the 80s, So I guess in some ways he might have been the reason I, as a teenager decided never will anybody know that I'm gay, because I never wanted to be disrespected in that way. And I obviously heard the things people were saying about him behind his back, or that people never took him that seriously, even despite his achievements. At least not within the family setting. Like they were, as to be expected. Back then, it was completely accepted and okay to mock a gay man for being effeminate. So they definitely had a big influence on that side of my identity. I mean, they have such a fascinating story. Of course, Alfred being a white Afrikaans South African who fell in love with this colored or mixed race man. I think at some point they had to move to Namibia for their own safety. Eventually they came back to South Africa. They settled in Cape Town, and started they didn't start the jazz art, but they took it over at some point, right at the beginning, and really turned it into what it became. So they had a big influence locally. And now they're back in Namaqualand, where they both grew up, and they've started the Garage Dance Ensemble, teaching the locals over there. I just think they're doing such fantastic work, and we certainly continue to support them.
Is there a particular discipline in your daily working life that you see as an essential ritual?
For me, I like to get up early. I feel my day is not the same if I don't get up early. I've kind of gotten into the habit, and it's probably been for the last 5-6 years that I get up at between 3:30 and 4:30 in the morning.
Wow.
I love it. I get to be alone. I have cats. I have plants that I care for still. And I just get to be in my own space. And I've been drawing in the last few mornings. I've been spending my mornings just drawing. I make fires in winter now. In the early mornings, I can make a fire. I think this ritual in the morning, making coffee, and I don't know, it's just that for me is where I get to kind of really pull myself together. Of course, I don't necessarily pray 5 times, but I often pray in the mornings too. And sometimes yoga.
Right.
Sometimes my partner and I will do yoga early mornings.
So that's a time of real thinking and pondering and, in a sense, working yourself up to the kind of making of the work.
Absolutely. I can sit still. I can imagine the whole day, everything I want to achieve in the day. I operate fine on 6 hours of sleep.
If you could live with just one work of art, what would it be?
Georgia O'Keeffe, The Clouds, that massive cloud painting at AIC. It always gets me.
Is there something in particular that gets you? She was really committed to a kind of emotional language.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's this super hyper feminine quality to it. But I think also just the stylization of these shapes, she's saying is clouds, that I believe her.
Yeah. And lastly, what is art for?
I guess art is just a space to make sense of things, at least for me, to process my life. I don't know. Art for me is just a space where, in time, things become clearer.
Igshaan, thank you very much.
It's been fun chatting to you. Thank you.
Igshaan Adams' Veerhout is at the Hepworth in Wakefield in the UK from the 22nd of June to the 3rd of November. His exhibition at the ICA in Boston in the US is on until the 15th of February 2025. Unravel, the Power and Politics of Textiles in Art is at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam from the 14th of September to the 5th of January next year. And that's it for this episode, and indeed for this series. Please subscribe to A Brush With wherever you're listening, and do give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Do also subscribe to our sister podcast, The Week in Art, a deep dive into the latest big art world stories, the top shows and the key issues every week. And please subscribe to The Art Newspaper at theartnewspaper.com. We're on X, formerly Twitter, at Tan Audio, and on Facebook, Instagram and Threads. Production, editing and sound design on A Brush With are by David Clack, and the producer is Lewis Jebb. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway. A big thank you to Igshaan Adams. Thank you for listening. Bye for now. A Brush With is sponsored by Bloomberg Connects. Download Bloomberg Connects today and discover cultural institutions on demand.